And this is the thing that really amazes me with the proponents. I'm not saying, and I've never said, and I've used the comparison of static testing and flight testing when it comes to aviation. Yeah. And I've made that point. Now, I'm not saying that they should do a comparable amount of testing when it came to the Saturn V rocket, only for the fact that we're talking enormous expenditures. But they didn't even match their own testing standards when it came to the Saturn 1B rocket, which, as you said earlier, is a much smaller, less powerful rocket. They actually did several unmanned launches of that to get it right, to make sure the engines were working properly. They didn't even match that with the Saturn V. And that's what really, really is baffling to a lot of people, is that they didn't even meet their own standards that they had set themselves.
No, good point. It's a good point. It's a point that a lot more people are picking up on. Now there's more interest in the whole Apollo program, given that the Artemis program is ongoing. We've had one launch of the Artemis rocket, which looks like a version of the space shuttle.
Yeah.
Big central fuel tank with 2 solid fuel boosters either side. Looks okay. It's a bit bigger than the space shuttle. But the space shuttle was developed in 1981. That was when it first launched. They didn't use anything from Apollo. They didn't use the F1 engines. I think they've used the H1 engine, which was in the second stage. Has the H1 engine been used for any recent rockets?
As far as I know, and I haven't looked into that in great detail, but as far as I know, the H1 engines were used, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody out there, leave some comments, I believe it was used only on the Saturn 1B, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, the J2 engines were used in the second stage of the Saturn V and then the third stage. But there's a point that you touched on, Marcus, and I want to kind of reiterate this point, is you mentioned the space shuttle going back. Now, that development of the space shuttle and the engine actually started back in the early 70s, but it's actually based on technology that goes back a decade before that. It's basically a variation of technology that was already produced in the 60s. So we're talking over 5 decades of technology when it comes to the Artemis. They're still using that technology, and they still have problems with that and getting that off the launch pad.
Yeah. Well, the one time they got it off the launch pad, it almost destroyed the launch pad.
Yeah.
Same way that Elon Musk almost destroyed his launch pad. The interesting thing is that there's been no development of rocket engines because for many years, NASA used Soviet or Russian-made RD-180 engines. That's what launched most of their rockets up until quite recently, because they were so reliable. And they were buying them 50 at a time. They were used on the Titan missile, they were used on the Atlas missile. So you've got the Soviet Union, as it was then, now the Russian Federation, was able to develop very powerful and reliable, that's the key point, the reliability of them, rocket engines. What were NASA playing at?
Yeah, and the other thing too, and it just came to mind when you were talking about that, is that when we're talking about the F1 engines and the combustion instability problems that they were having, specifically brought on by, it appears, the cooling system, the methods of cooling that they were using at the time, they no longer use that. They're now using a Soviet-style cooling system in their engines. And the question arises, and you've raised this question yourself, Marcus, and I have not heard anyone come up with a reasonable answer. Why, if it works so well, that cooling system, why are we not using that in other rockets? And why are we not using the F1 engines for Artemis, since the F1 engines work so well, right?
Okay. It's yet another of those logical questions that sensible people will ask, and non-sensible people will try to diffuse the question by pointing you in directions which have nothing to do with the answer. If the Saturn V rocket with the F1 engines was so successful that it launched 13 times, I think it was altogether, it includes Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz link-up. That was the Saturn V rocket. They still got one left over. It's at the Kennedy Space Center. Huge, great thing. Yeah. And of course, anybody seeing it will say, wow, what a huge piece of kit. They would need something like that to get to the moon. No, you need something much bigger than that.
And 3 times that, and then times that size 3 more times. Actually, we're coming up to that. We're going to be talking about that because that's getting into Wernher von Braun territory now, I believe.
Well, yeah, it's also getting into Elon Musk territory because he's doing it right.
Exactly. So let's go into our next point here. I have
Okay.
highlighted. And this point, Marcus, it's on page 36.
Yep.
And it's just above the title deadly radiation. We'll get to that one later, but it's just above that, some of the best evidence.
Yep, got it.
Some of the best evidence proving the fraudulent lunar landings is the fact that in December of 2014, NASA sent its new Orion spacecraft uncrewed directly into the Van Allen radiation belts, a deadly 30,000-mile thick radiation field that starts at about 1,000 miles. That is above Earth, which is about 650 miles, 1,050 kilometers, above the highest of all other manned space missions in history, except the claimed Apollo astronauts who would have had to travel through this deadly radiation field twice for each mission, once to the moon and once back. So I think what I'm reading from that is it's a problem now, but wasn't a problem then.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. Because a lot more people are now aware of what space consists of, because we've taken an interest in it. All the people researching Apollo have taken an interest in it because it's part of the whole summary of space travel.
Yeah.
Space travel is a dangerous thing to do for humans. I mean, we're delicate little creatures, us humans. We're very good at living on Earth under 14.7 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure. We don't notice it because it's all around us. You get into space, there's no pressure. Space is a vacuum. There's nothing there. So we've got this whole idea that space travel is just sort of a matter of getting up there, getting into orbit. No, it's not. You've got to have your protection. Not just against radiation, you've got to have protection against the vacuum as well. And that is not evident. In fact, it's conspicuous by its absence. Any protection against vacuum, which has known properties, create a vacuum chamber here on Earth, and there are certain things which will happen. Liquids will boil, otherwise known as outgassing. Metals will cold weld, fuse together for the same reason, because they're outgassing. That's conspicuous by its absence. People talk about radiation because it's rather hard to avoid it, and it was first discussed by James Van Allen, after whom the belts are named, in Scientific American in March 1959, where he said that space travel would be dangerous unless protection was offered. He recanted that 10 years ago, under pressure. He said, no, I didn't say that. Yes, he did. He said it was a dangerous place to go.
Well, actually, that leads into the next point here, which I'd like to expand on that.
Yeah.
Page 37, right down on the very bottom on the left-hand side, James Van Allen, and this is his quote. Okay. James Van Allen, the discoverer of the radiation belts, originally said that they were, quote, 100 times more radioactive than a lethal dose and, quote, 1,000 times more lethal than expected, unquote. Under pressure from NASA, he dramatically recanted his original findings in order to make it appear as if the Apollo missions were technically possible. The quote above shows Van Allen's original published findings in the respected national journal Scientific American in 1959. People, remember that, Scientific American 1959. In which he plainly spoke about the radiation belts beyond Earth orbit being, quote, an obstacle for practical space travel to the moon and beyond, end quote. Just as Kelly Smith of the Orion mission reiterated, Van Allen himself said this immediately after NASA sent probes with Geiger counters into the radiation belts. And this is a direct quote, as he did again in 2014. And this is again a direct quote from Van Allen himself. Quote, our measurements show that the maximum radiation level as of 1958 is equivalent to between 10 and 100 roentgens per hour, depending on the still undetermined proportion of protons to electrons. Since a human being being exposed for 2 days to even 10 roentgens would have only an even chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight, end quote. And that was from 1958 from James Van Allen himself. I don't know how any more clear you can be about this.
No, it's very, very clear. putting the Geiger counter, it was put onto Explorer 1. That was the first American space mission launched. And they had the Geiger counters on board, and the Geiger counters recorded high levels of radiation. And then they were blown out because they didn't set them high enough. So they had to send another one up on Explorer 4. And that was when they determined that there were two belts. So James Van Allen was quite correct, because the level of radiation. Now, at this point, somebody might say, well, you've got satellites up there at the moment. Yes, you have. Unmanned satellites do fly through those belts into orbit. Geosynchronous orbit is about 20-odd thousand miles out. But satellites are not humans.
No.
And they can be protected against radiation. In the same way that when you're going to have your tooth x-rayed, you're given a lead apron to wear. Lead is a very good protection against radiation because it's a very dense material. But none of that is known to exist on any of the Apollo spacecraft. So how were the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts, protected against radiation? It's a question I put to the manufacturers of the spacesuits, who company were making the spacesuits for the Apollo astronauts. I said, what radiation protection are you building into these spacesuits? And could these same spacesuits be used technicians to go into Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and now Fukushima, and clear up the mess? And they said, you should direct your question to NASA. We only constructed the spacesuits based on their specification. I'm still waiting for the reply from NASA, because I don't think they can give me one.
How long was that?
Oh, it was about 20 years ago. Now, if NASA knew how to protect astronauts, not equipment, not unmanned satellites, that can easily be protected. But humans, us delicate little creatures, how are we to be protected against radiation in space? That's the question. Unless NASA come up with a decent, convincing answer, one has to say that they didn't offer protection.
Yeah.
And the Apollo astronauts only went into low Earth orbit because they couldn't go any further.
Right. But Marcus, doesn't that just raise a very interesting point here? I was thinking of, when you were talking here, came into my mind, I'm always thinking when you're talking, came into my mind, ingredients. You have this ability to make me think. I was thinking of ingredients when you're talking about protection. And I'll get to what I mean by ingredients in a second. If NASA prides itself on being able to protect its astronauts from intense radiation through the Van Allen belts, not to mention the other elements outside of that, between that and the moon. So you have cosmic radiation, you have solar radiation, you have the coronal mass ejections, so solar flares of any kind. And we didn't even get into all the other elements of danger. We'll leave it right now with radiation. You would think that NASA would be highlighting and boasting about its ability to protect astronauts from this really harmful radiation, besides telling us, well, we went through the radiation belts in 10 or 15 minutes. It's really fast, so it's not a problem. That's what you get from NASA. That's their reasoning. But it took like 3 days to get from there to the moon. So what about all the other elements? That argument falls apart when you talk about getting through the Van Allen belts. So it kind of made me thought of the last 3 years is that a certain company who came out with a certain solution to the certain virus out there said, oh, we've got the solution. Take this, but we're not going to tell you the ingredients. And it's the same with NASA. We're not going to tell you how we protected the astronauts. Just take our word for it. We protected the astronauts. But isn't that always the government's response to anything? When they come out with something and tell you it's good, you're not allowed to know the details. You're not allowed to know the ingredients. It's incredible that proponents themselves either refuse to see this, don't see it, refuse to see it, or know it, and are trying to argue a point. They're defending a client. That's what a lawyer does. Yeah. Whether they're guilty or not, they're defending their client, and that's what the proponents are doing. They're defending their client.
Good point. Yep.
Did you want to add anything to that before we lead into the next point?
Yeah, I was just going to go off on a slight tangent.
Go ahead.
How many people are fully aware of Operation Mockingbird? It's a real thing created by the CIA, clowns in America, following the Kennedy assassination, to ensure that the press at the time, the printed news and the television news, followed the narrative that had been created by the Warren Commission report. I know it's a subject of your of a new book you're going to be producing quite soon, but it applies to Apollo as well, because Operation Mockingbird basically meant installation within newsrooms, both TV and print, of CIA operatives who would maintain the narrative that had been put out. They would ensure that the editors worked properly. Henry Luce of Time Life magazine was a prominent feature in that. So Operation Mockingbird is the area that controls people who claim that some things are conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories have a habit of being right, not the unevidenced information that they claim it is. It's not unevidenced. Conspiracy theories will only work if there is evidence to support them. Oh, I know there are a few weird ones, but the basic stuff, if it's a conspiracy theory to say that no human has landed on the moon, prove they did, and that will destroy the conspiracy theory. But they can't do that. There isn't evidence to show that humans have landed on the moon. So we've got this ridiculous situation now where there's two factions, those who claim to be following the narrative that humans landed on the moon, and those who say, well, prove it, guys. You know, you say that humans landed on the moon, let's see the evidence for it. And they'll say, oh, there's plenty of evidence. We've got photographs of them on the moon. No, you haven't. By the way, the total number of photographs of humans on the moon is 5,771 over 6 missions. Those are easily created at the Air Force Base in New Mexico, where it was being done. We're not talking high technology here. We're just talking something that happened in a different location, because it was all photographic film. These were not digital images. These images showing humans on the moon, they were taken with photographic film cameras. And photographic film, the Hasselblad cameras, the Maurer film cameras, and photographic film is known to be damaged at the very least, destroyed at worst, in a vacuum. And the vacuum on the moon is greater than any testing chamber available here on Earth. The Sandusky chamber in the Glenn Research Center in Ohio can only go up to about 10 to the minus 6. That's what you get at the International Space Station.
I was just going to ask you that,
Yes.
about 200-mile altitude, right?
Yeah, 200-mile
Yeah.
altitude.
Yeah.
Because the further away from Earth's surface you go, the less pressure there is. If you get out to the moon, you've got virtually none at all, 10 to the minus 12. So the idea that humans landed on the moon in those conditions is complete fabrication, a fraud. It's a fiction. Come on, guys, prove me wrong when I say that. Nobody has done it yet. I've been doing this for 30 years and I haven't been proved wrong yet.
And I'm getting a lot of comments from viewers about that comment you made over and over. They keep saying how you keep saying, prove me wrong. And they keep constantly flashing back to where they claim you said the opposite. And I keep telling them that, number one, we don't really know what happened there. And so what? 20 years ago, if Marcus had that opinion, I had that opinion. I don't have that opinion any longer. I have evolved. And the more I learn, the more my opinion changes. If that's the only argument that they have, then they have nothing. They have nothing to come back with. For the viewers out there, I don't want to get into this subject right now, but Marcus mentioned Henry Luce from Life magazine. Yes, I am writing a book. It's half done on the JFK assassination. I will talk about that in a later video. I don't want to get into that right here, but I did want to add one point before we move on, and it was a very good point. I don't know if Henry Luce was the owner of Life magazine at the time Kennedy was assassinated. But it's interesting to note that Life magazine has always been a corrupt magazine. They've been owned by the deep state, and they got their hands on the Zapruder film, and then they kept that hidden for almost 15 years.
Yeah.
It wasn't until that came out and that a lot of people really had a lot of questions about what really happened that day. So I just thought I'd add that little point. It was a nice little sideline that you brought up. So I just wanted to make that a point. Shall I read on, Marcus?
Yeah, read on, because it's good stuff.
Yes. Okay. Another item that is trotted out as alleged proof that the fake moon missions actually happened is the existence of all those lunar rocks that they supposedly brought back from their travels. In August of 2009, it was reported, albeit as a news oddity, and it certainly was, that an alleged moon rock personally given to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands by Neil Armstrong in 1969 who supposedly handpicked it off of the lunar surface himself for this purpose, was opened 40 years later from its presumed permanently, hermetically sealed container by a curious museum curator after he had watched A Funny Thing Happened to the Moon, which is Bart Sibrill's documentary, with great interest. Following his microscopic examination, the rock was verified to actually be a forgery. It turned out to be a deceptive, out-of-this-world looking piece of petrified wood. Yet again, not a single journalist, except for myself, asked the question, quote, if the moon rocks are fake, what does this say about the moon missions? Unquote.
Yeah, exactly. That Rijksmuseum moon rock was quite big news at the time because it was considered to be a curiosity. It was following the renovations in the Rijksmuseum where they were changing some of the exhibits, changing some of the rooms. The Rijksmuseum, by the way, is where the magnificent Rembrandt painting Night Watch is permanently displayed. It's a national treasure of the Netherlands. It will never leave the country. Anyway, 2009, they were renovating part of the Rijksmuseum and they dismantled the space exhibits. And amongst the exhibits was this piece of moon rock. I mean, we knew it was moon rock, didn't we? Because it said on it, moon rock. Had to be moon rock, come from the moon. Trouble is, nobody took the trouble to work out, because it was said to have been presented by Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins, the crew of Apollo 11, to the then Dutch Prime Minister. The trouble is that all the alleged moon rocks were in quarantine at Houston. None of them had been released. At the time, the Apollo 11 astronauts were touring on their giant leap tour following their alleged landing. So they couldn't have presented anything to anybody because they didn't have access to anything to present. So because it turned out to be a fake piece of petrified wood, probably from Arizona, it caused a great deal of amusement because, oh, look, fake moon rock, because that's all it was. It was presented as moon rock, but it was fake. It was from Earth. Now, there are moon rocks on Earth. The Soviets brought some back, 300 grams, which is about 12 ounces, less than 1 pound of a rock. That was brought back because the Russians were able to land a craft on the moon, scoop up a little bit of regolith, the dust on the lunar surface, fly back to Earth, same as they'd done those 2 tortoises earlier. The Russians were quite good at space travel. So this idea that these moon rocks were part of the evidence as presented by proponents of NASA's narrative is complete fabrication. Yes, they've got a claim to have 840 pounds of moon rock. That's what they brought back over the 6 missions. And President Nixon, who was then at the time president, presented a piece of moon rock, we're told, to all American states, all 50 American states and 90 foreign countries, most of which have been lost. You can't find them. There is one in the Science Museum here in London, and the official Dutch moon rock in the Netherlands is in a museum in Leiden, another city in the Netherlands. So this fake moon rock is such a ridiculous story because in 2002, I think it was, a gentleman walked into the moon rock storage depot at Houston. It was all stored in a big filing cabinet, put it on a trolley, took it outside, put it on his pickup truck and drove away with it. So the security wasn't very good. But we're told these go to universities around the world who've examined this moon rock and have determined that it's from the moon. Well, of course they've determined it's from the moon because it arrived in a box marked moon rock. The research they were doing was paid for by NASA. So guess what? He who pays the piper calls the tune. They're going to say it's from the moon. Nobody can prove otherwise. There's a great deal of unexamined moon rock still at NASA. What's the problem with releasing it?
Yeah, that's the point that always baffles me too, is that there's an estimated, the exact figure, I think it's over 800 pounds of moon rock was supposedly brought back by the Apollo missions. They never discuss how that was actually done, like how that would affect re-entry of the command module, because you're dealing with, once you enter Earth's forces, now you've got to deal with weight and balance and lift. You do need a certain amount of lift when you enter the atmosphere. The command module itself is designed specifically for that in order to give it some stability, right? So they never talk about any of that. And that works out to an average of 140 pounds per mission. That's not exact. I'm just doing an average here. It was 50 on one mission and like 200 on another mission. But that part is never mentioned, the actual weight and balance, the technology involved in order to make sure that space capsule will stay stabilized when it re-enters. And the other thing is, too, people are under the impression that anybody can check these rocks out, right? And that's not entirely true. NASA screens very carefully the people who request to have a sample of the moon rock for whatever purpose, whether it's a high school teacher, a college professor, it doesn't matter, anyone. And usually those rocks are given to people who are specifically connected in some way, indirectly that is, to NASA or to one of the mainstream science institutions where they may have to rely on funding from the government. So you're not going to get any independent thinking. We know that now. Independent thought when it comes to any institution run by any aspect of the government is very biased. You're not going to get an outside thinking scientist who's going to tell you, who's going to do a real analysis of this, right? And I will add to that one more point, is that these moon rocks, and I think you mentioned this earlier, or you alluded to it for sure, have gone missing.
Yeah, they've gone missing.
Again, this brings back what I said earlier about everything under one roof in a museum, all of it cataloged. This was supposed to be the most important accomplishment of mankind in the 20th century, probably of all time, if you want to get truthful about it, basically what NASA is claiming. And yet these rocks have disappeared. Some of them disappeared. Some of them are fake. People do not get access to these rocks. And then they have 700 pounds of rock that are just sitting there. What are they sitting there for? What are they hiding? Marcus has the proof right here.
Here's my piece of moon rock. Prove it's not. I say it's a piece of moon rock. How do I know it's a piece of moon rock? Because I say so.
Exactly. Yeah. I love it.
It's technically called breccia, which is an accumulation of different parts of the Earth's crust, because that's where it came from.
But isn't that the point, though, that you're actually making, is that their proof is because I say so?
Yeah. And I say it's a piece of moon rock.
Exactly.
Look at it. It's rather good. It looks like what we expect moon rock to look like.
Yeah. Okay, Marcus, moving on. So this is at the top of page 38.
Yeah, got it.
Even more proof of the moon landing fraud is the fact that according to NASA itself, all of the blueprints of the hypothetically miraculous technology, advanced hardware that allegedly put a man on the moon on the very first attempt in 1969 were deliberately destroyed after the supposed missions, as well as was all of the technical specifications of the spacecraft, along with all the flight data that recorded the spacecraft's actual location during the missions. You would think that such one-of-a-kind, supremely valuable and expensive designs with all of their irreplaceable data would be kept for just short of all of eternity, both as a record of the achievement and in case such costly to attain information and equipment would be needed again to return to the moon. Let me just read that one last part again. That is, both as a record of the achievement and in case such costly to attain information and equipment would be needed again to return to the moon. Yet the exact opposite is true. This touches a little bit on what we were talking about earlier, where none of this information was gathered up. There was no effort on the U.S. government's part with all their resources to gather all this information, all the documents, the telemetry tapes, and we're talking not just the telemetry tapes for missing tapes for Apollo 11, we're talking about all of the missions. They found a couple of canisters related to Apollo 9, and that only went as far as low Earth orbit. All of the other telemetry tapes, about 140,000 plus reels of telemetry tapes, and we're talking wheels the size of car steering wheels. This was big tape, 15-minute tapes, have 15 minutes worth of information. That's why there's so many of them. Have gone. Enough to fill a couple of houses, medium-sized houses, have disappeared. I actually believe they were destroyed, and I write about that in my first book.
Yeah.
And this, again, goes to this whole point. Where is this information? Well, why would you destroy it? Why? Because it's too expensive to keep? Can you think of anything else today that we're spending money on that we don't need to?
Exactly. It's such a ridiculous story as well.
Yeah.
But we're expected to believe it. That's the thing. Just because we're told this is the case, oh, you've got to believe it because NASA says so. No, never a straight answer.
Yeah, exactly. If I was part of something valuable, think about it this way. Let's bring it down to a personal level. Let's bring it down to an individual personal level. You have something that you value so much. What are you going to do? You're going to bury it under everything else where you can't find it? No, you're actually going to put it in a safe. And if it's that valuable, you're going to put that safe, or you're going to put that document or merchandise or whatever it may be that's so valuable to you in a safety deposit box. Yeah. You're going to take really good care of it. And you're going to make sure that wherever you store it is fireproof. You're going to do that. Now let's bring it up to a national level, NASA and the Apollo moon missions. An estimated back then $30 billion, equivalent to what, $200 billion today, was spent on these missions. Lives were lost. Apollo 1 crew were killed in a tragedy. I have my suspicions about what happened there, but that's a subject for another day. Lives were lost. The inspector who was concerned about quality control himself was killed along with his family in some freak accident. Okay? Lives were lost. And then you had the enormous expenditure and the enormous resources that were put into this from an estimated as 400,000 people that had no idea what the end game was. Everybody was working on their little part, right? The backing of an entire nation, the United States and the world, at least initially, not now, but at least initially, and they couldn't find the resources to put all this documents that Bart Sabril has just mentioned here under one roof, under one museum, the Apollo Moon Missions Museum. They couldn't find the resources to collect all this data. Sorry, folks. That smells to me.